this performance is half original, half plagiarized. I've said a bunch of Auden lyrics, and so the music is original and the lyrics are his. You've got little leaflets, and so you can follow along. I put a lot of poetry in there. I don't sing all of it, but it's just good to have to kind of see his range and some of his great poems. So yeah, we'll talk about his life, about his poetry, and play some songs. So here's W.H. Auden, for those of you who don't know, the greatest poet of the 20th century. And he's the greatest for three reasons, according to me. First, I think is his range. He had an incredible ability to write in many different meters, forms, moods, styles, from opera to kind of nonsense poetry. I mean, even if you don't agree that he's the greatest poet of the 20th century, you have to agree that for English language poets, he had the most range. So number two, his penchant for collaboration. He's probably one of the great collaborators of the 20th century. He worked with musicians, artists, other writers. He wrote libretti with people. You know, so many poets that I think artists, especially in the 20th century, are very touchy. You know, they don't like to have their work messed with or compromised with, and he was the opposite. So, and I think you can actually feel that. At least I feel that when I read the poetry and feel like I want to set it. There's almost a sense that you're collaborating with him still, and he had a real love, and he talked about it a lot too. It was important for him. And the third reason, because we're here, he was an Anglo-Catholic, so staunch Anglo-Catholic. In fact, he was so staunch that he became an Eastern Orthodox person at the end of his life. But he didn't sort of convert, but during the 60s and 70s, you know, the Book of Common Prayer was going through revisions, and he really had a problem with this. He was progressive in some ways, very conservative in others. This is from one of his poems in the 60s. The Book of Common Prayer, we knew, was that of 1662. Though with it sermons may be well, liturgical reforms are hell. And this is a snippet from a letter he wrote to his priest in 1968. Dear Father Auden, have you gone stark raving mad? Aside from its introduction of a lesson and psalm from the Old Testament, which seems to me admirable, since few people go anymore to matins or evensong, the new liturgy is appalling. Our church has had the singular good fortune of having its prayer book composed and its Bible translated at exactly the right time, i.e., late enough for the language to be intelligible to any English-speaking person in this century, and early enough when people still had an instinctive feeling for the formal and the ceremonious, which is essential in liturgical language. I implore you, by the bowels of Christ, to stick to Cranmer and King James. Preaching, of course, is another matter. There the language must be contemporary. But one of the great functions of the liturgy is to keep us in touch with the past and the dead. And what, by the way, has happened to the altar cloths? If they have been sold to give money to the poor, I will gladly accept their disappearance. I will not accept it on any liturgical or doctrinal grounds. With best wishes, W.H. Auden. So, nightmare sort of a letter for a priest. I personally came to Auden not through academic studies. I have a PhD in religion, and I teach liberal arts out in Naperville. But actually through songwriting. In college, I got a little book of his light verse, and just found that if I had a chord progression or some melody or something, I could open it up and get a song out of it. So I've been stealing from him for about 20 years now. And at a certain point, I don't know, 6, 7 years ago, I had a bunch of songs, 10 or 15 songs, and I wanted to put it together into a kind of thing, lecture, performance, whatever you want to call it. And so we actually were able to go to Oxford for a couple months, had a little fellowship, and we were able to do it there. Of course, Oxford is where Auden went to school, and he was the professor of poetry there, so an important place for him. The book that I used, I think it's called Auden's Light Verse, was put together after a Hugh Grant romantic comedy came out in 1994. Some of you have probably seen it, Four Weddings and a Funeral. Yeah. I don't know if you remember, it's an okay movie, right? It's a fine sort of movie. There's a moment though when during the funeral, this guy dies unexpectedly and his partner recites an Auden poem. And it's a really moving moment. It's well recited, well acted, and it caused this really resurgence in interest for Auden, and so his publishers like scrambled to put together a book that they thought could sell, and they were smart because it did, and so they put together all his light verse, which is like songs, ballads, nonsense verse, little kind of ditties that he composed, and yeah, I got that book, and most of the songs that I've said are from that book. It's really well done. So we'll sing Funeral Blues right now, which is the poem that is recited in the movie.
It's on page 15.
Yes, page 15. Remind me that.
Yeah, I see.
That's right. Okay. It's from a play called The Ascent of F6. The play is not produced anymore, which is probably fine, but the poem has become kind of well known. Stop all the clocks, cut off the telephone, prevent the dog from barking with a juicy bone. Silence the pianos and with muffled drum, bring out the coffin, let the mourners come. Let airplanes circle overhead, scribbling on the sky the message he is dead. Crepe bows round the white necks of the public doves. Let the traffic cops wear black cotton gloves are. Both my north, my south, my east and west, my working week and my Sunday rest, my noon, my midnight, my talk, my song. I thought that love would last forever. I was wrong. The stars are not warm now. I'll put out everyone back up the moon and dismantle the sun. Blow away the ocean, sweep up the wood for nothing now can ever come to anyone. And I'll stop you before you go mad with applause. I'll just go through these. You can hold your applause if you decide on applauding at the end. Just for sake of time. I hate clapping.
Like a good Anglo-Catholic.
Yes. So most serious poets would roll in their grave to think it takes 2 grand romantic comedy to get your sailors back out. But Auden wouldn't have minded. He was a very serious poet who loved his Dante and Shakespeare and Latin and Greek and all that, and very well educated and very sort of classical. But he also loved Cole Porter, Lewis Carroll, Edward Lear. He said that good poets have a weakness for bad puns. And the following is not a pun, but it's possibly the longest palindrome in the English language. I think it's on your first page under shorts. Auden claims it was the longest, and he wrote it in honor of T.S. Eliot. T. Eliot, top bar, notes putrid tang emanating, is sad. I'd assign it a name. Nat dirt upset, drab hot. Auden comes of age during the heyday of modernism in the 1920s. He talks of reading Eliot's Wasteland for the first time and bursting out in laughter, but then rereading and seeing deeper and deeper stuff in the poem. This pinnacle of literary modernism. Auden, when he was very young, did imitate Eliot a bit. Watershed, which is on page 6. I won't read it, but it's an early poem of his, and it shows you as his kind of modernist side. When a reader complained of obscurity in that poem, he apologized in a letter, saying obscurity was a bad call, thus proving he was no modernist. So Auden agreed with the modernists like Pound and Gertrude Stein and T.S. Eliot that the post-World War I world was a strange and broken place that posed an immense challenge to the artist attempting to hold a mirror up to it. The modernist answer, though, was not his. To be a little glib, with apologies to modernists, The modernist answer was to make art as difficult and broken as the world around them. So foreign languages, obscure illusions, stilted meters. Ezra Pound kind of sums it up with his mantra, break the pentameter. Auden's answer was very different. He thought that the old forms, like the ballad or the sonnet, which you'll hear today, well, the ballad at least, or the good old iambic pentameter line, still had resources as yet unmined. One of the ways that Auden makes these old forms new is to bring in a plainer diction, everyday language, informal speech, gay slang. Auden was very modest, but one of the things he bragged about was that certain gay slang terms that he and his friends used appeared in print for the first time in his poetry. So terms like plain sewing or Princeton first year, which if you don't know what they mean, you don't need to. They're in his poems for the first time. He actually, one of his longtime dreams was to end up in the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary, and he's in there like 7,000 times now at this point, or no, 700 times. Shakespeare's got like 33,000, so it's, you know, it's relative, but he was very proud about that. So, you know, instead of the modernist move of kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, Auden brings more babies into the tub, which is how I like to think about it, his contribution. When people asked Auden about the origins of his poetic vocation, he often told a story about a childhood obsession. He says that his first poetic experience was not poetry, but was as a young child constructing elaborate imaginative worlds around the abandoned lead mines of his native York in the north of England. He would devour technical mining manuals and delight in showing off to his elders with words like pyrite, fool's gold. A word like this, he says, was for me not simply an indicative sign. It was the proper name of a sacred being. So that when I heard an ant pronounce it Pyrrhic, I was shocked. Her pronunciation was more than wrong, it was ugly. Ignorance was impiety. So on the one hand, his poetry is rooted in a childhood game. Auden's definition of a poet is someone who plays with words. On the other hand, one has to take this play very seriously. There's something sacred. Auden liked to quote Nietzsche's definition of maturity, to recover the seriousness one had as a child at play. He starts writing poems when he's about 16. As he tells it, he's out on a walk with a friend. They don't have much to talk about. It's a little awkward. And so the friend asks him, apropos of nothing, have you ever written any poetry? And according to Auden, even though he'd never written anything, and even though up to that point he just assumed he'd be a mining engineer, he immediately realized he was going to become a poet. And you know, to read his biography is to be immensely jealous of someone who knew exactly what he wanted to do before he went to college and never deviated a hair from it. His very first meeting with his tutor at Oxford, he tells the man, I'm going to become a poet. And this guy, I forget his name right now, is a well-known critic. He's like, well, maybe you should study literature. You know, kind of taken aback, and Auden realizes he's not being taken seriously, and he says, no, you don't understand, I'm going to become a great poet. While he was at Oxford, he took a class from Tolkien, J.R.R. Tolkien, Lord of the Rings fame, of course, you all know and love. And he was a philologist at Oxford, a genius with languages, and he was reciting some Old English one day in class, Beowulf or something, and Auden was just stunned by it, and he skipped the rest of the semester, all his classes, and just holed himself up in his apartment and learned Old English. And you won't be surprised to learn he didn't get great grades. But this was his way of going about things, especially with poetry. He would hear something new, something that, you know, offered something to him, and he'd just get it. He'd descend into its depths and grok it, to continue with the sort of nerd references. And I bring up the Old English because for Auden, Old English was very important. Very briefly, the Old English line, some of you are probably aware, is accentual, the poetic line. It measures beats, right? And it would have been probably recited with a musical instrument. And so like the poetry of Homer, you know, it's very musical. And a good example is the fee, fi, fo, fum, I smell the blood of an Englishman. So a lot of our kids' poetry is coming from that kind of accentual heritage. 4 beats per line, typically, fee, fi, fo, fum. But you can put as many syllables as you want into that line, right? So a very flexible meter. And I think it explains a little bit why Auden's poetry, even the stuff that's not in accentual meter, has a kind of openness and musicality to it. At least that's how I think about it. And if you look, go home and search for some of these songs on YouTube, you find an immense variety of settings of them, by established musicians, but also just by, schmucks like myself, who just found something wonderful and musical in it. But what really strikes me is the range of musical styles. Obviously, he worked with, Benjamin Britten, Stravinsky, really top classical musicians. But there's jazz settings, folk settings. I mean, most of the stuff we do is American kind of folk. So I think that's in the poetry in some way. So after he graduated from Oxford, Auden went to Berlin for 9 months with his friend and very casual, sometime lover, Christopher Isherwood. And it was typical, of course, for a young cultured Brit like Auden to go to the continent for a little while after the university, the Grand Tour it was called. Usually, places like Rome or Paris or Athens, very important cultural stuff. Auden wanted dive bars, and he especially wanted dive bars where middle-class fellows like himself could pick up and pay for the services of young working-class Germans. So in the Berlin of the Weimar Republic, in the 20s, these were a dime a dozen. Isherwood wrote a collection of stories from that time. One of those became Cabaret, the musical and the movie. And that movie, I don't think I've seen it on stage, but the movie does a pretty good job of showing you the freedom of that time as well as the looming darkness it's obviously all about to fall apart on them. Auden wasn't just having fun, though, in Berlin. He was probably taking his flings more seriously than his peers were taking the Parthenon or the Last Supper. Auden really believed at the time that he could cure himself with the bourgeois neurosis that he felt infected all his class. He'd been reading Freud. Freud found in his father's library from before he was a teenager, way too young to read Freud. His father was a doctor, and the first doctor in England to sort of know Freud and actually use him in his practice, even though he's a medical doctor. And so Auden's German escapades were serious attempts to sort of self-analyze. He said that the affairs he had in Germany he should have had when he was 16. He also said that the only analysis we need is love. I think Freud would have agreed with the first one, probably not with the second one. But one out of two pretty good. Coming home from the continent, late 1920s, one of the first jobs he gets is to write plays for the Group Theatre in London. The Group Theatre is a left-leaning, sort of art for action's sake kind of place. Auden had become a communist and an atheist right about the time he started writing poetry. And so this was a very dynamic time and a dynamic place. Benjamin Britten was there. A lot of really important musicians and artists were at the Group Theatre in London. And a lot of the songs that I've set here were first performed in that setting, usually not like a cabaret setting. He worked with a woman named Hedley Anderson, who was English but had trained in Germany and sort of studied the cabaret tradition. She came back and Auden wrote a lot of songs for her. Obviously, Auden being gay and homosexuality being illegal, it was a little dangerous to, preach it from whatever pulpit you might have. And so a lot of these songs are in a woman's voice to a man, and it was one way that Auden had to kind of express himself. So he used Hedley Anderson and female singers to do that. So this is one called Ballad. It's on page 7. And I won't talk about the poetry too much. I do a little more usually, but if you have questions or want to chat, during coffee hour, come get me. So I'll just kind of sing these and maybe say a couple words. Is that sound so thrills the ear? Down the valley, drumming, drumming, it's only the scarlet soldiers dear. The soldiers come. What is that light I see flashing so clear over the distance, brightly, brightly? It's only the sun, their weapons dear, as they step lightly. people down there, why are they suddenly wheeling? Perhaps a change in the orders, dear. Why are you kneeling? Doctor's care, haven't they raised their horses? Horses ride, they are none wounded, my dear. None of these horses. Is it the parson they want with white hair? Is it the parson? Is it? No. They are passing his gateway, dear, without a visit. Oh, it must be the farmer who lives so near. It must be the farmer so cunning. They have passed the farmyard already, dear. Now they are gone. Where are you going? Stay with me here. Were the vows you swore me deceiving? No, I promise to love you, my dear, but I must be leaving. It's broken the lock and splintered the door. Oh, it's the gate where they're turning. Their feet are heavy on the floor. Their eyes are burning. La la la. Man, it's hard to play. I'm not letting people clap. At the end, save it. Okay, so in the 30s, Auden became very interested in politics and in the power of poetry to make a difference in the world. In 1937, the Spanish Civil War broke out, and Auden followed other European and American intellectuals to the battlefield to make a stand against Franco's fascists. He volunteered as an ambulance driver, but the Spaniards perhaps had heard a little something about his driving skills, which he didn't have any. They didn't let him near the steering wheel of any vehicle, much less an ambulance, and had him distributing propaganda. He stayed for 2 months, hated it, and skittered back home, hardly uttering a word about his experience. One gets a sense that he was a bit embarrassed over the whole thing. In Spain, with all these other writers jazzed up to finally do something, hunched over their notebooks, doing nothing but what they could have done much more comfortably in France or Germany or England. He did, though, write a poem called Spain. That's one of the best poems about the war, and one of the only people who didn't like it was Auden. I would typically talk a little bit about this poem. It's a wonderful poem, but Auden's collected works is a massive sort of doorstop, and none of his political poetry is in there. You can find it anthologized in a lot of places. They're great poems. Another one is September 1st, 1939, written right as Hitler invades Poland, and it actually got a lot of airtime after 9/11. But again, he didn't like any of his poetry in which he sort of became political, so he had kind of allergy to it, and it was probably overly critical of his own poetry. Nevertheless, I mean, he wrote constantly, so it's not like there's any dearth of his poetry. So, as he grew older, though, a simple love of language trumped any political positions he may once have held. I gave you Auden's definition of a poet as someone who likes to play with words. He completed this thought by saying that the only serious thing is to love one's neighbor as oneself. Auden's mature opinion of the relationship between poetry and politics is that poetry does nothing. A formula he repeated often, sometimes in his poetry. Nevertheless, Auden allowed that poetry could be like a parable, helping one to unlearn hatred and learn love. He claimed that the primary function of poetry, as of all the arts, is to make us more aware of ourselves and the world around us. I do not know if such increased awareness makes us more moral or more efficient. I hope not. He says. I don't know why. However, he goes on to say that poetry makes us more human, and I'm quite certain it makes us more difficult to deceive. In another place, he claims that poetry's true power lies not so much in its ability to enchant, but in its power to disenchant, to allow us to take away the wool from our own eyes, whoever put it there, ourselves or others. I'm going to play a song from a long poem of his called The Sea in the Mirror. It's a meditation on Shakespeare's Tempest, which of course is all about the enchanting powers of art and sort of the dangers of that. You can maybe draw your own conclusions about what Miranda thinks about this. She's one of the most enchanting figures in the Tempest. But I don't have too much time to go into a kind of a reading of the poem. But it's a villanelle. It's called Miranda's Villanelle. And
It's on page 19.
Page 19, sorry. My dear, what is mine? As mirrors are lonely, as the poor and sad are real to the good king in the high green hills. Sits always by the sea. I'll jump the black man behind the elder tree, turned a somersault and ran away, waving my dear on his time. As mirrors are lonely, the witch gave a squawk, the venomous body melted into light as water leaves a spring, and the high green hill sits always by the sea. This crossroads too, the ancient prayed for me. Down his wasted cheeks, tears and joy were running. My dear, what is mine? As mirrors are lonely. He kissed me awake, no one was sorry. The sun shone on sails, eyes, pebbles, anything in the high green hills. Sits always by the sea. So to remember our changing garden, we are linked as children in a circle, dancing. My dear, what is mine? As mirrors are lonely in the high green hill, sits always by the sea. One link is missing across the room. My magic is mine. Happy Miranda. The fear that entold you, the only one in creation, dances for death. So, let's see, where am I? Right. In Spain, Auden had an experience that not a few newly minted communists shared, that atrocities were committed on both sides of that war. The destruction of old and beautiful churches and the horrible crimes against against nuns and priests by the communist fighters, had started to turn him back to his religious roots and sort of pulled him away from communism and from politics in general. The ballad I played previously was written prior to Auden's escapades in Spain, and the only thing that I'm aware of him saying about it is that he was inspired by a painting of Christ being led away by the soldiers in Gethsemane. But if you look at that poem, which is a kind of dialogue between two lovers, one of which is betraying the other for a political reason, it seems that you can see Auden, or you can see that Auden is seeing himself in the betraying lover. And I think that during this time he imagined himself capable of doing whatever it took for a political cause. And he really rejects this in his middle age. I mentioned Auden's work with the Greek theater when he was in his 20s. He wrote a few plays for them. Some of them are very, very silly and kind of deserve to maybe be where they are now, which is never performed. Some of them, though, I think are pretty good. He's obviously very experimental, lots of surrealistic stuff. This one is called The Dog Beneath the Skin. Has anyone ever heard of it? I mean, you don't see him very much. Have you?
Page 8.
Okay, you know everything, Bill. Yeah. A play, but it's got this wonderful lullaby in it, and again, it's one of these things where the play is not well known, but little bits and pieces from it stick around. So this is called Now Through Night's Caressing Grip. Page 8. Now through night's caressing grip, earth and all her ocean slip, capes of China slide away from her fingers into day, and the Americas incline coast towards a shallow line. Now the ragged vagrants creep into crooked holes to sleep. Just and unjust, worst and best, change their places as they rest. Awkward lovers lie in fields where disdainful beauty yields, while the splendid and the proud naked stand before the crowd, and the losing gambler gains, and the beggar entertains. May sleep's healing power extend through these hours to our friend, unpursued by hostile force, traction engine, bull or horse, or revolting succubus. Calmly till the morning break, let him lie and gently wake. So I won't talk about this one too much. I'll just note that it's an example of what I think is a tragically overlooked genre, the creepy lullaby. And Auden was a master of it. There's another example in your leaflet. I don't know the page number. It's just called Lullaby. But I'll skip a little bit of the close reading and shift gears to talk about one of Auden's literary obsessions, of which he had many. He said, "If I have any work to do, I must be careful not to get a hold of a detective story. For once I begin one, I cannot work or sleep till I've finished it." It might not be quite accurate to call it a literary obsession, because Auden didn't count it. He didn't count the detective story as art. The ballet and photography were also not art, according to Auden. I don't know why. But he loved the scenario of the whodunit and its formulaic plot, which he described in the following way. The murder occurs, many are suspected, all but one suspect, who is the murderer, are eliminated. The murderer is arrested or dies. This usually happens in a pastoral setting, and Auden said he simply couldn't read one that wasn't set in the English countryside. You have a bounded and happy community, a kind of Eden that is shattered by the murder, and the work of the sleuth is to restore the community to its prior blessed condition. And this is really a skeleton key for all of Auden's poetry, or for a lot of it. There is a good world in which something has gone wrong, and the poet has the call to fix it, to heal it, to heal the world. When W.B. Yeats died, Auden wrote a poem in memory of the great Irish bard. He didn't have a lot of nice things to say about Yeats when he was alive, but when he died, you get this wonderful poem, one of the great elegies. And it's in your leaflet, page 14. the whole thing. I'll just read the last 3 stanzas, which are, I think, a pretty good. Follow poet, follow right to the bottom of the night. With your unconstraining voice, still persuade us to rejoice. With the farming of a verse, make a vineyard of the curse. Sing of human unsuccess in a rapture of distress. In the deserts of the heart, let the healing fountain start. In the prison of his days, teach the free man how to praise. So, going back, the imaginative matrix of the 6-year-old Auden is filled with magical, broken down lead mining equipment. That of the mature Auden is filled with sin, suffering, healing, and forgiveness. There's a phase in between those two, elements of which are very prominent in Auden's poetry of the 20s and 30s, in which the imagination of the poet is dominated by what Auden called unconscious forces, the 2 most important of which were sex, which Auden understood through a lens polished by Freud and D.H. Lawrence, and the march and tide of history, which he took in a Marxist vein. The sex drive of the individual and the collective drive of history are so powerful that the puny person must get out of the way or be trampled. Auden rejects this view in his middle age when he realized that it simply left no room for the personal responsibility that he felt is crucial for love. I've said this all rather simplistically. It's probably better to understand these 3 phases or sort of moods of Auden as kind of sharing time in his best poems. I think if you read In Praise of Limestone, which is on page 16, one of his all-time great poems, you can really see that. You can see the three Audens talking to each other. But in this next one that we're going to play, the transition from the second to the third is very noticeable. There's a transition from an unconscious love of untrammeled animal beauty to a love that is fully human because it is voluntary. Much key terms for Auden, and you have to kind of pay attention when they show up. Well, yeah, this is page. Good question. No, I got it. It's page. I had it. It's called Fish in the Unruffled Lakes. You might have to find it.
10.
Yes, page 10. That is correct. Page 10. Fish in the Unruffled Lakes. Fish in the unruffled lakes, their swarming colors wear. Swans in the winter air, the white perfection have. The great lion walks through his innocent grove. Lionfish and swan act and are gone upon time's toppling wave. Wait till shadowed days are done, we must weep and sing. Duty's conscious wrong, the devil in the fall. Goodness carefully born, for atonement or for luck, we must lose our loves on each beast and bird that moves, cast an envious. Sighs the folly done and said, twist our narrow days, but I must bless, I must praise, that you must long. With all gifts to the swan, impulsive nature gave the majesty and pride. Last night should I, your voluntary. Okay, so 10 minutes, we're going to talk about love. When you talk about love in Auden, you have to talk about Chester Cowman, the man that Auden fell head over heels for just after coming to the U.S. in 1939. Auden was 32, Chester Cowman was 18, so barely legal, I guess. But very precocious, very brilliant, Jewish, son of a dentist in Queens, I think. important. They actually did Auden's teeth. And, you know, Auden had lots of flings with lots of working class men, some women, but nothing like this. He'd never fallen in love before, and he went completely bonkers. He was wearing a ring, calling it a marriage within 6 months. In a letter he wrote to Cowan at the time, he said, "Have you really the wish to endure the boredom of healing what without you will never get well?" And proclaimed to him that we the livelong day shall part no more. He inscribed in a book that he gave his young lover the words from one of his poems, that love comes just when I'm picking my nose. I've set this one as well, it's a nice one. And they both apparently pick their noses in public a lot. I've read this, so. Weirdly enough, Auden was married at the time to a German woman, Erika Mann, daughter of the famous novelist Thomas Mann. She was Jewish, and they got married in the 30s. She, obviously facilitated her escape from Germany. And Auden was trying to get all his friends to do the same thing. He said, "What are buggers for?" But he really took marriage seriously. He said that, like everything, which is not the involuntary result of fleeting emotion, but the creation of time and will, any marriage, happy or unhappy, is infinitely more interesting than any romance, however passionate. Beneath it all, Auden was the marrying type. Chester Cowman, unfortunately, was not. He, after about a year into their relationship, he had an affair and told Auden, "Look, we can be friends, but not lovers." I'm going to skip a little bit here. On page 11 is a section from a Christmas oratorio, and it's about the betrayal that Joseph experiences, when he realizes that Mary is pregnant. It's a wonderful kind of meditation, but it's also he admits that it's inspired by Chester's infidelity. I won't recite it here. But what I will say is that, even after they broke up, and it was very traumatic, Auden admits to nearly murdering Chester. They collaborated on libretti and poetry for the rest of their lives. So it shows the seriousness with which Auden took his friendships, but also his collaborations. I think we have room for a couple more songs, and we'll play the last two songs, and I won't say anything just because we're running out of time a little bit. If you want some weird anecdotes of the weirdness of Auden, we can go into that later. I usually end the talk by just listing through 10 or 12 things that show how weird he was. He worked with Stravinsky on The Rake's Progress, which is one of the great operas of the 20th century. And Cowman and Auden did the work together. You can't, even scholars looking at it can't always tell which is Auden and which is Cowman in the work. So they were 51, I think. And it's the very end of the opera. And it's called Barcarolle, which is an operatic form, sort of a song meant to be sung on a gondola. So it's got a really nice lilting sort of meter, and I try to imitate that with the music. I probably don't do as well a job as Stravinsky did, but who does?
It's on page 12.
Maybe we'll skip the intro out and just get right into it. Okay, all right.
Sure. Maybe play like 25.
All right, ready?
Okay.
3, 4. Across the waters float, the crystal waves dividing. The sun in the west is going to rest. Glide, glide, glide towards the islands of the blest. Orchards greenly embrace that undisturbed place. The weary soul recalling, slumber and dream, while many the stream falls falls, falls, discounting on each child I need. I am lamb and deer, untouched by greed or fear. About its woods are straight. Quietly now, the blossoming bough sways, sways, sways above the clear, unclouded brow. Okay, and we'll play one more from one of his first operas. He actually collaborated on it with Benjamin Britten, and it was completely destroyed in the press. I don't know if it's ever been performed again. Well, no, it must have been performed again because I have a recording. It's not bad. It's Paul Bunyan, but it took a lot of chutzpah to write an opera on Paul Bunyan, 10 minutes after coming into the United States. And, it does have some awkward, sort of forced Americanisms in it. I actually kind of like it, but it's, again, one of these things that you just never hear or see performed. So this is called Gold in the North. It's on 5. Good. I get very organized, but by the time I get to the end of it, it's all just...
Ready?
Gold in the north, came the blizzard to say, I left my sweetheart the break of day. Gold ran out and my love turned gray. You don't know all braving the cold. This is, I think, the most pretty Right. Yeah. If you have questions or comments, talk to probably are. Yeah.
A comment but a quick question.
Yeah.
First of all, I want to say that if I had you both as instructors in college, I would have been a lot more. Very well. I love the musical settings. Just it's so engaging. Tell me, how long on average does it take you to set the music to one of your films?
Well, setting it actually goes very quickly.
Does it?
Even